Hello, everyone. My name is Joan Chambers. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Outreach for SysGrip. Welcome to our Episode 1, Patient Data Collection 101, the Voices from Within Humanizing Clinical Research Data webinar series. As we go to the next slide, again, just another welcome for joining our discussion. And on the next slide, it's my pleasure to introduce Jane Myles, VP Clinical Trial Innovation of Curebase, and Kim Andreasen from Director Data Management from Curebase. So at this point, I will turn it over to Jane and Kim to walk through this 15-minute flash webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan, and to the SysGrip team for allowing us to be part of this conversation. It is the first of 3 that we will go through together this year. And today is really about data. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Curebase. So Curebase has a mission to make clinical trials accessible to any patient anywhere. And we've done that through a combination of end-to-end technology to allow decentralization of a clinical trial, along with clinical trial services and CRO services. So now it's a combination of technology and services really in service of patients and allowing them to participate in trials. Next slide, please. So today we want to talk a little bit about the myths or maybe the stories about data collection and why data is important in clinical trials. So clinical trials have been conducted for about a century now, and mostly they have been done in what we call brick and mortar settings, at hospitals, at clinics, places where you would typically meet with physicians. The technology changes over time have enabled us to change how trials can be run. So that could be decentralized, or it could be brick and mortar, or it could be hybridized. But the point of clinical trials has been and continues to be the collection of clinical data to make decisions about the safety and efficacy of new treatments. And Kim is an expert in the processes involved in that data collection and management. This slide shows you a trend that's important to call out. So remember I said data collection is actually the core of clinical trials. You can think of data as the primary deliverable of clinical trials. And what this slide shows, thanks to the Tufts University's data, is that the actual amount of data that is being collected is increasing exponentially. Part of that is because of technology. Part of it is because we have more things we want to collect, but that increased volume of data can add to data collection complexity and certainly data management complexity. So we didn't want to dwell on that. We just wanted to reinforce clinical trials are all about data collection. And now we're going to flip over to the next slide to show you what that looks like. Oh, I'm sorry. Now we can keep going. There we go. So Kim is an expert in data management, and this slide is a simple depiction of what might happen. And Kim, can you orient us a little bit to this slide and what happened in regular trials and how that's shifting a tiny bit in decentralized trials?
Absolutely. As I talk through, I'll explain the differences between the two. So while data is our primary deliverable and it's what we're looking for, we cannot get data without having study participants and patients involved. So it always starts there for us. So in a clinical trial, the first thing that will happen is you'll meet your clinical trial care team. This will be a doctor, what we call a clinical research coordinator that's similar to the nurse's aides that work within a doctor's office when you go for your appointments, a nurse who is there to do particular procedures that are required to have a nursing license to do, such as possibly draw blood, vital signs, doing other tests that would be required in the process of completing examinations. We would also have a phlebotomist, potentially, someone who is dedicated to just drawing your blood. You could be sent to an imaging center to get an MRI or an X-ray or a CT scan. The difference between brick and mortar and a virtual clinical trial is that in a brick and mortar, you go to them. You go to the clinical research site, you take your time, you travel, you go, you wait for your appointment, and you're seen. In a virtual trial, what we do is you meet with the doctor and the coordinator through virtual telemedicine visits, just as if you were calling into your doctor's office to have a visit instead of going, as many of us did the last 2 years when we really couldn't leave our homes. In the process of this, we can also, through a virtual trial, send the nurse or the phlebotomist to you in your home, in your office, wherever it is that's convenient for you to have that taken. The one thing that we can't do in virtual that is still brick and mortar is that if we need an MRI, you have to go to an imaging center to do that.
I have a question from the audience, and it's a great one. As a participant, do you have the right to review your own data?
So when it comes to data review, the right that you have as a patient is that if anything is identified in your health, you must be informed. You can ask to have the information that's collected shared. When we do virtual trials, we collect a lot of that information directly from you. So when you answer questions about your symptoms, you provide that information to us. So you see what we are putting in. Jane, do you want to speak a little bit more to regulatory concerns around patient data or regulatory requirements around patient data review?
Well, say more about that. What are you thinking?
So as a patient in any medical situation, we have the right to ask to see our information. In clinical trials, while some of the data may not be available to review, such as if you're in a drug trial where you're testing a standard of care versus an experimental treatment, that information will not be made available to you immediately unless there is an emergency situation.
I think that's a great way to think about it. So I'm going to go back to the fundamental premise of a clinical trial, which is about gathering data to understand, is the new treatment safe and effective? If the data itself needs to be blinded, then just as Kim mentioned, that data is probably not going to be available for you as the participant to see, and may not even be available to the physician to see, depending on the nature of the endpoint. So let me think. I'll make up an example. If you were testing a new medicine for diabetes and your blood sugar levels were the endpoint, this is not a great example because you have to test them as a participant anyway, but if there was a lab value that was going to give evidence of which of the treatment arms you were in a trial, you might not get to see that on a regular basis. Maybe Kim has a better example.
No, I think that's really an excellent example. However, as I said, if your lab results indicate that there is a health problem, you must be informed of that by the care provider. So while you might not be able to get your exact lab report, if by chance you're taking this diabetes medication and your A1C had been staying around 9 or 10 and all of a sudden you're at 15, they have an obligation to tell you that your A1C is elevated to the point of being dangerous.
So Kim, tell us a little bit, like I see there could be data generated by the participant, that could be me actually, or it could be generated by the site as the physician has a telemedicine or an in-person visit and does specific assessments. What about the right side of that page? What are you talking about with data coding, collating?
Absolutely. So when we get data in this world that we live in, we know that we like to have it computerized. And when we do that and put it in, you have your care team that you are interacting with that looks you face to face, talks to you by name and greets you like that. But when we put the data into the clinical data management system that we have, we assign a number. We control a big part of my job is controlling who can see your name, email address, telephone number, address, and identify you as a person. Because in my position, I'm not allowed to see that. But a clinical research coordinator or a doctor certainly needs to be able to know who you are as an individual. So we go in through a process of coding or de-identification where the actual clinical trial data that will be sent to the sponsor, to government entities to get the drug approved cannot be linked back to you as a person. And that is a key factor. It's controlled by global and national regulations in every country in terms of how much we are allowed to share across. So there is a great deal of information put in to make sure that we cannot link. Once it gets to me, I can't go back and say, oh, hey, this was Jane's blood test for her COVID trial that she did. I am not able to do that because I cannot know that in any possible way.
I think that the reason that it's critically important that that name, the individual, is attributable, that's the word I use, to the physician and his or her staff is exactly for the reasons you called out. So if the physician sees a new value or evidence of something that should be taken care of medically, he or she can reach out to you as a participant. So it's an additional safety layer, if you want to think about it that way.
Absolutely. And, we always want to, virtual trials, brick and mortar, does not matter. We want to make sure that your clinical trial care team is interacting with you, dealing with you as a human being, creating that connection that you have, because this is part of your healthcare team, even though it's a clinical trial. But then when we get into doing analysis of it, creating pretty graphs and tables like you would see coming out of a census report, we don't want to be able to see that information. So if you were to go back and look for, a woman in my age range, which I'm a woman, I'm not going to disclose my age range, with a certain level of education working in the pharmaceutical industry, you would be able to tell how many people were living in my town at that time that met that criteria. But you can't go back and say, oh, hey, that's Kim Andreasen. It's not, well, I was living in a very small town that might have been identifiable, but if I were living in a larger city, definitely that would not be identifiable in any way. And it would only be identifiable to me because I would know my own characteristics when looking at a table like that.
So I guess the takeaway message here, simplifying things a little bit, is clinical trials are all about collecting data. Oh, we have a question. That data has to be managed in a way that protects privacy and also allows the physician appropriate medical oversight of the individual participant. We have a question. Will my information be published or seen on the internet?
No. If you talk about your information as being the person that you are, knowing your name, date of birth, any of that information, no, it will not be published in that way. It will be grouped together into other categories. So let's talk about just simply aspirin. Everybody knows that taking a low dose aspirin was supported as being a prophylactic for a heart attack. Well, studies went on and we found out that that works for men, but in women, you have to take a higher dose. But at no point can I go back through when I'm looking for numbers to that to correlate to some other thing that's going on or to make a point in a presentation. Can I say, hey, where's my mother's name? Because she was one of the people that participated in a study like that. I can't find her individually, but I can find the group just because I was her personal caregiver and part of her home care team, as to which, hey, these women still experience cardiac issues while taking a lower dose, but they did not experience severe stroke symptoms. So that's just from my personal information and things that have gone through in people that I was caring for myself. But there is no way when looking through a publication that I would even know which study it was that actually was published.
So the data gets kept in ways that maintain privacy, security, and quality, the physicians retain their appropriate oversight of your data. So if something medically relevant comes up, there's a mechanism to reach out to a participant. But the data is used in an analytical way, not to publish who's been in which trial. I am going to advance to the next slide, please, because I know we're getting short on our time now, but I see we have another question. This is just a hold the date advertisement for a second, because we are going to talk a little bit more about clinical trials and probably around patient experience in them. The question, some patients' genotypes do not support ASA use. That is true.
That comes from the analysis sets that we get out and the trends that we identify. That, you know, the bigger picture is people fit in this category or that category or whatnot. But the individual categories, we don't know who had that genotype, who was able to fit into that. So it's one of those, I call them bulk conclusions that we get from this when looking at the data. So there is not a single product on the market that only has a yes and no, this works or this doesn't work. And we collect a lot of information from you to determine how this fits in.
That could be a whole PhD thesis on pharmacoepigenomics, but we'll get there another day. Thank you very much, Kim and Lindsay and Joan. I think, we have some follow-up questions, and if we didn't get to them today, we'll find a way to reach out and try and provide some answers. Lindsay and Joan, do you have any last words?
No, it was absolutely wonderful, Jane and Kim. Thank you very much for sharing all your insights on this episode number 1 webinar. We look forward to everyone attending the next episode 2 and 3. So again, thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks.
Bye
Thank
now.
you.